China, is it your no, what is it? Trubshaw? Which one are you? Yes, I know. What's your first name again?
John.
John, that's right, John. Hi, John. David. Okay. All right, so this is, just for those who haven't been here before, this is a series I teach every Wednesday evening, except during the summer, going through the principle very slowly. It takes about a year to get through the whole thing. Quite a lot of detail. Just stopping, having conversations, discussions, not trying to get to the end of anything. So, Hasane, come in, welcome. So, anyway, so if you want to stop me, just ask a question. If you disagree with me, just say so. We can have a discussion about it. So that's just the way it works. Yes. So at the moment we're just looking at the history of restoration. We got as far as Moses. So last week we started looking at Moses' course, and we got as far as where we got to where we're starting today. And so we looked last week at how things went wrong and how Moses went into the desert, how he came back, and after meeting God, and then looking now at the second course of restoration to Canaan. And so during the second course of restoration to Canaan then, as Moses has formed this relationship with God, he's made this foundation of faith, his relationship with God, so that he can stand in the position as a central figure for the foundation of substance. So people can experience and feel God working through him. He's got this sort of charisma, this presence, and people know that he is in touch with God. They can feel God's presence. So it's very important then, if you're going to be a team leader or any kind of leader really, is to have this foundation of faith. And then you come into the presence of God's presence and God's grace. Gives you lots of wisdom, lots of ideas, the right thing to say at the right time, etc., etc. Anyway, so he then became the leader, and then the Hebrews were supposed to work together with him, unite with him. So as I said, he made the foundation of faith, which we'll look at in more detail. And the foundation of substance for the Hebrews they should love Moses, and they should respect him, realize that actually God is working through him. They should listen to what he had to say and follow his directions. And then together they could have multiplied goodness. They could have created and done lots of good things together. So this is where we've got to so far, is that Moses has just gone to appear and speak to Pharaoh. And then we get to this point here, where God says to Moses, go and talk to Pharaoh. And God says to Moses, you are to say everything I command you. And your brother Aaron is to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his country. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you. Okay, so this is what we're going to be looking at today. Examining some of the 10 plagues. Well, 10 plagues, really. So here they all are. The plague of locusts, blood, frogs, lice, fleas, livestock died, boils, hail, locusts. We got locusts twice? No. Darkness, and then the death of the Egyptian firstborn. So, first of all, did these things happen? Secondly, what about the moral issues? What are the moral issues here? What's the moral issue?
God hates the Egyptians.
Well, it says that God says he will harden Pharaoh's heart. So what ethical issues does that raise then?
It's not fair.
Not fair. What ways?
It seems to be predestined that they will, that's what they need to suffer. Because if the Pharaoh is not going to say yes to Moses, then there's no way plagues can be avoided. Right.
So if God hardens Pharaoh's heart, what does that suggest? Is Pharaoh a free agent? So if Pharaoh is not a free agent, is he responsible for the things that he does?
Well, if he's not free, then he isn't.
No, because no freedom without responsibility. If you're not free, you're not responsible for the things that you do. So if God hardens Pharaoh's heart, what's going on there then? It brings up these issues of fairness. Is that fair to hold Pharaoh and the Egyptians responsible? What about all the extra suffering that people went through? So these are the sort of moral issues we want to look at as well. So, first of all, who here thinks these things happened? 2, 3, 4? 3 people. Okay. Who thinks they didn't happen? Nobody. Who hasn't thought about it before? All right, if you're honest. And who's waiting for me to tell them the right answer? No, I don't give right answers. Just wanted you to think about it. Anyway, it's an important thing. Sometimes people read this and they say, well, was that possible? Yes? Was that possible? So let's have a look at that first issue first. Can we believe what's written in the Bible? Okay, so this is a book called The Miracles of Exodus, written by someone called Professor Sir Colin John Humphreys. Until recently, he was a Goldsmiths Professor of Material Science at Cambridge University, and I think still is Professor of Experimental Physics at the Royal Institution in London. So is he an intelligent person?
Seems to be.
Yeah. Is he a scientist? Right. Yes. So you would think. So he also happens to be a believer. I don't think he's not a fundamentalist Christian or anything. He just happens to believe in God, and he happens to have a very curious mind. He's always interested in these things. Was it possible that these things happened? And so he wrote a book about it. And there's a little, save me giving you the explanation. There's a little thing here. I've never tried this before. Don't know if it's going to work. I just realised it's going to require sound. Assuming it's going to work in the first place. Oh yeah, it is. Okay. Is there? There's 2. Which one is it? This one? Okay. So shall we have a go? Okay, just ignore the first 10 seconds. I don't know how to chop it off. The rest of it's good.
Over 3,000 years ago,
This is where it starts properly.
Pharaohs, a series of catastrophes befell the land of Egypt. These events are told in the Old Testament book of Exodus. Could they have really happened? The story of the 10 plagues has fascinated and mystified scholars throughout the centuries. And this mystery has become irresistible for scientists who want to explain what may at first seem inexplicable.
You find positions across the spectrum, from those who take a very strict historical perspective that everything happened just exactly like it said in the tags, to the other extreme where nothing that's talked about in the text actually happened, that it's legendary or some other such word. And a number of us want to find our way between those two extremes.
The Bible is a very strange book in lots of ways. Even biblical scholars in the last 150 years have been emphasizing how very strange it is, because for one thing, it's not one kind of literature, it's many, many different kinds of literature. It's poetry, short story, history in part, chronology.
When we're beginning to plan out an investigation, what you do is say, let's first of all see what it is that we have to explain. About 10 years ago, I happened to read a letter in the British journal called The Lancet, which alluded to the 10 plagues of Egypt. And I wondered if anyone had bothered to look at rational explanations for each of the 10 plagues.
Well, I got really interested in the Exodus story because I'm a believer and I'm also a scientist. I thought, well, science has got a real input to make here because
That's that chap from Cambridge University.
Extraordinary natural events, and so I thought, can there be scientific explanations behind these events?
It's a mystery as to did this story really happen just like this?
The eruption of Santorini was one of the biggest eruptions in the last 2,000 years. It ejected something like maybe 25 cubic miles of debris into the atmosphere, and it definitely affected the whole of the eastern Mediterranean. There's no doubt about that. It is known that the ash found in the area of the Nile comes from Santorini because chemically the composition is identical to the composition of the ashes found on the remains of Santorini itself. Steady build-up of activity over a period maybe of months, and that could have led to a range of phenomena occurring in Egypt. The fallout may have caused the river water to change its composition in some way to allow algae to grow, and algal bloom, which could have been reddish in colour.
There's a modern phenomenon called a red tide. What it is, it's due to algae, which if the conditions are right, they can bloom and they turn a bright red colour, and some of them emit toxins. These are called harmful algae, and these harmful algae will kill fish.
The next group of plagues, if you like, frogs and lice and flies, maybe they're all related to some problem with the ecosystem caused by the impact of the eruption on the river.
Fish were and are an major check on the ecosystem. So if you have tadpoles that are allowed to mature, you may have a massive explosion of amphibians.
Uneaten eggs turned into record numbers of baby frogs who subsequently fled to the land and died. Their little rotting frog bodies attracted lice and flies.
The Aramaic term for lice could have been any small biting insect, anything.
By looking at the science of what happens and looking what the subsequent plagues are, we can come to what this particular gnat was, and it was a biting midge.
This biting insect affected both humans and animals, suggested that the insect involved is not a louse. A human flea doesn't bite a dog, and a dog flea doesn't bite a human. The same is true of lice. If you begin to look at the sequence about the fish dying and the frogs proliferating, the frogs dying and the midges, then you would have an environment in which there would be a lot of proteinaceous decaying matter, which would allow a fly to also proliferate into massive swarms. The question is, what kind of flies?
Stable flies, and they're really unpleasant because they bite. And not only do they bite, their bite leaves open wounds on human flesh and on animal flesh. Now, the fifth plague was the death of the livestock.
The lice carried the tongue virus, which killed 70% of Egypt's livestock.
So the biting midge, which is the third plague, can give rise to the fifth plague of the death of the livestock, and these specific livestock.
The sixth plague, boils and blains, not just one thing, boils and blains, affected the Egyptians and their animals.
I believe that was caused by the fourth plague, which was a plague of flies, because the stable fly inflicts painful bites, which when infected, they lead to boils. So it fits beautifully together. So the fourth plague led to the sixth plague.
This is potentially quite easy to explain in the context of a volcanic eruption, because when you have a huge amount of ash pumped into the atmosphere, the ash acts as nuclei for water droplets to form, and those water droplets, if they're carried high enough up, will freeze and they will form hailstones. So torrential rainstorms and hailstorms during volcanic eruptions are not at all uncommon.
After the plague of hail was a plague of locusts. They only happen some years, and they only happen when locusts find damp.
Then we need to go to the next one.
The ninth plague was 3 days of...
Okay, anyway, the locust one, you said that when locusts find damp ground, which would have been the result of all that hail, they can lay lots more eggs, and more of those eggs hatch. So that's why I'd expect a swarm of locusts eating up everything after a lot of heavy rain and hail.
What about darkness? There have been many people thought this might have been eclipse, might have been fog, it might have been ash from a volcano.
I've been in volcanic eruptions where you can't see literally your hand in front of your face. Tambora eruption, which is one of the biggest eruptions we've seen in the last 1,000 years, in Indonesia in 1815. Huge event. It was pitch dark 600 kilometers from the actual eruption site. Now that's not, Egypt is not very much further from Santorini than that. So it's perfectly possible to explain this period of darkness by the climactic eruption of the volcano.
The final plague is the plague where the firstborn humans and the firstborn animals die.
Whatever it was, it occurred after dinner. It killed the Egyptian people and their animals within a matter of hours. It left no external visual stigmata, but if you look at the preceding plagues, you'll see the Egyptians were hungry, near starving. They probably had stored grains in vaults.
The grain would have been wet, it probably would have been contaminated by the feces of the locusts, and so it would have turned mouldy, toxins would have bred there. In the last World War, tens of thousands of Russians died by eating contaminated grain, so this is known a relatively modern event as well. The firstborn was special. The firstborn Egyptian in the family was the heir to the throne, as it were. If there wasn't much grain at all, probably the firstborn ate a lot, right? And there was just nothing left over for the others to eat. So that's a plausible reason for why the firstborn died.
An alternative is that any ash that fell out of the region could have been carrying toxic chemical elements. Now this is not unprecedented in relation to volcanic eruption. It's a big event, a big eruption in Iceland in 1783, known as the Lark eruption. And the ash that fell out across the island there was contaminated with fluorine. And the fluorine led to illnesses, bone disease, all sorts of problems in both humans and livestock.
It would seem science can explain that what at first glance appears to be an unnatural sequence of events may be caused by the very hand of nature itself. Could it be that natural phenomena of this kind were witnessed and recorded faithfully in the Old Testament of the Bible?
Okay, I'll stop there. So, any comments on that? Interesting, yeah?
I think it would make sense, but what I always struggle to fit in the picture is why only the Egyptians and not the Jewish. Because I mean, this is something that affects, as an area effect, and not sort of specifically targeting people, isn't it? And that's why I'm not sure how to do it.
Well, they didn't live together. They lived in different parts, different places. Yes. The Hebrews all lived in their own particular town called Goshen. So, sometimes weather is very localized and all sorts of things. So that's possibly why they weren't affected. Anyway, it's interesting. You see this in the Bible, you think, well, that's impossible. People say these are miracles, and other people say, well, miracles don't happen. But actually, when you start to look at these things from a modern scientific point of view and start to try and unpack it, it looks like it's a record of a historical memory. Now, obviously, not all the details are written down there, but what is written is a sort of memory, just a very, very, just these sequence of events have been recorded. But from the perspective of modern ecology and modern, environmental science, it's quite possible that this took place. So this, of course, raises the question: were there miracles then? What are miracles? Was this a supernatural intervention? Did God go and do this? So how did it all start? Do you remember? It started with a volcanic eruption off the coast of Greece, which is, it's recorded. It was a huge volcanic eruption, and the volcanic cloud went all the way across because of the prevailing winds to Egypt, and there's lots of dust there, which is found in the Nile Delta. around about the same time as the Exodus is supposed to have taken place, suggesting that was a possibility. So did God make the volcano erupt, or would it just happen anyway?
It would have happened anyway, but God...
Ah, hey Neil. Hi. And then, could it have been angels? Or how could you tell? How could you tell if an event was supernatural or just natural? How would you tell? Can you tell? Supposing you were there at the time, would you have thought, well, this is an amazing lot of weather we're having at the moment? Or would you think, well, this is God doing it? What would you think? Don't know. So maybe some people thought, well, this is an amazing lot of weather we're having. Some people may think, well, this is a miracle. Or was it just something completely natural, in which case it was a coincidence that it happened? Anyway, so this is what Einstein said. He said there are two ways you can live. You can live as if nothing is a miracle, or you can live as if everything is a miracle. So it depends what you mean by a miracle. I think obviously it seems to be a natural phenomena, all these 10 plagues, which can be explained from the point, scientifically. But if you look at it from another perspective, you could see, well, maybe this is a miracle, maybe this is God working. Yeah. Okay, so then Moses went to meet Pharaoh, and so we'll go through these plagues in a little bit more detail and see what was going on. So Aaron threw down his staff in front of the Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. And Pharaoh summoned his wise men and sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians also did the same thing by their secret arts. Each one threw down his staff, and it turned into a snake. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Yet Pharaoh's heart became hard, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. So why did Pharaoh's heart become hard here? Did God make his heart hard? Is heart hard, or what? So put yourself in Pharaoh's shoes, and if Moses and Aaron come along and done these little magic tricks, and your magicians have done the same sort of thing, but his snake had swallowed up their snakes, would that have been convincing enough to persuade you to let them all go? Anyway, so his heart became hard, so he hardened his heart in that sense. He wasn't convinced, that wasn't enough. And so at that point, then after this, then the Nile turned to blood, which as we saw was probably the consequence of this volcanic eruption. And all the frogs came out of the Nile because, all the algae and everything meant the fish died. Because the fish died, the tadpoles weren't eaten up. Because the tadpoles weren't eaten, there's an overabundance of frogs, and they jumped out of the water and they went into everybody's bedchambers and made a nuisance of themselves. So Pharaoh said to Moses, "Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord." So what's Pharaoh doing here? He's saying, if the frogs go, then I will let you go, your people go to make sacrifices. But so Moses said a prayer, the frogs all died and disappeared. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief from the frogs, he hardened his heart and would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. So again, he hardened his heart, he made that choice, as God predicted he would. And then after the frogs, there were the gnats. Since the gnats were on the people and animals everywhere, the magician said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen, just as the Lord had said. So what's going on here then? So Pharaoh's magicians and his wise men, they can see what's going on. They realize that this is not magic. It's not something they are capable of doing themselves. They realize it must be something supernatural. So they say, this is the finger of God. This is God that's working. But Pharaoh, though, closes his heart. He doesn't want to listen to them. He's made up his mind. And after the gnats, there were the flies. And Pharaoh said, I will let you go to offer sacrifice to the Lord your God. If you get rid of the flies, I'll let you go to offer sacrifice to the Lord your God. Moses answered, I will pray to the Lord, and tomorrow the flies will leave. Nice to have some fly repellent like that, wouldn't it? Only let Pharaoh be sure he does not act deceitfully again by not letting the people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord. Then Moses prayed and the flies left. But this time also Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not let the people go. So you can see here, Pharaoh then is very deceitful. He says one thing and then he changes his mind. And so because of this, then he's hardening his heart. His character is changing. Because he's doing evil, he is becoming evil. Because he's not keeping his promises, then his conscience has been eroded and he's becoming harder and harder and a worse person. Yeah? Step by step by step by step. Then after the livestock were killed, died, Pharaoh investigated and found that not even one of the animals of the Israelites had died. Yet his heart was unyielding and he would not let the people go. Yeah, so he was becoming then very obsessive. You get this with dictators sometimes. What happens with dictators? Were any of you alive when Iraq was invaded? The invasion of Iraq with Chemical Alley.
2003.
Yes. When the Americans were invading Iraq, and then the Iraqi government minister of information would come on the television every day saying what great victories the Iraqi had won, how the Americans had been defeated. And it was clear, everybody knew what was going on. But he and Saddam Hussein obviously were living in cloud cuckoo land. They were completely disconnected from reality. And you can see that's often what dictators become like. Like Hitler became the same kind of person. As the war went wrong, people would tell him, and he didn't want to hear the bad news. He only wanted to hear good reports. He completely, became more and more obstinate. Yeah, and eventually just killed himself. Yeah, he just wouldn't face up to reality. And that's what you can see the Pharaoh here is doing. Step by step by step, he's becoming obsessive and basically nuts. Anyway, after the hail, Pharaoh said, this time I have sinned. So finally he realizes he made a mistake. I've sinned. The Lord is right, and I and my people are in the wrong. I will let you go. You don't have to stay any longer. So, change of heart, change of mind. Moses replied, but I know that you and your officials still do not fear the Lord God. So Moses said, I realize, you're just going to change your mind again. You're not sincere. So when the Pharaoh saw the hail had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. Yeah. So, Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart, and the hearts of his officials, so that I may perform these signs among them. You may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians, how I performed my signs among them, that you may know that I am the Lord. So the first 5 plagues, I can't remember, 5 or 6 or 7 plagues, the Pharaoh hardened his own heart. But by this stage, once you got to that point, was it then possible for him to genuinely, sincerely repent and change? He really got to the point where, as I said, he's just becoming like many dictators become, completely obsessive. So then you had the locusts. Pharaoh's officials said to him, how long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go so they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined? So all his officials, they realized the reality of the situation, and they were telling him, don't you realize? But he could become completely stubborn, and obstinate, and refuse to change. Even his officials realized. So Pharaoh said then, okay, Moses, go worship the Lord your God, but tell me who will be going. And so Moses told him, we'll all be going. Men, women, children, families, the whole lot will all be going. Then Pharaoh said, no, have only the men go and worship the Lord. In other words, all the women and children should stay behind. So again, it says the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart and he would not let the Israelites go. So that's, as I said, Pharaoh was in the state, basically by this time, he completely hardened his own heart to become an individual tyrant. So now, who's the problem then? Why do you think God did? So here, the last few plagues, it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now, why do you think God would be doing that? Who now is the problem?
The Israelites were going to become a problem. The Israelites were going to become a problem.
Yeah, okay. When Moses first went to Pharaoh to say, "Let my people go," do you think the Egyptians would have been happy for all their slaves to pack up their bags and leave? No. Would the officials be happy? The bureaucrats? No. Would the Pharaoh be happy? No. So after a few plagues down the road, how do you think the public opinion is changing? The ordinary Egyptians, who are the ones who are suffering, probably thought, go. But the officials realized, well, that's our labor force. We want to keep them. A few more plagues down the road, the officials realize Egypt is ruined. Now who's stopping it? It's only Pharaoh, okay? So the point here is that by the time they left, the Israelites didn't feel any sense of animosity towards the Egyptians. They only felt animosity towards the Pharaoh, because they realized it's only the Pharaoh that caused the problem. Yeah? So they didn't have any bad, as we'll see later, they got on very well with the Egyptians. They had a very good relationship with the Egyptians. It wasn't the Egyptians that was the problem, so they wouldn't later be blaming the Egyptians. They would only later be blaming one single person, this individual tyrant, the dictator. Yeah. So that, you could say, is why Pharaoh hardened Pharaoh's heart, so that it would only be Pharaoh would be the only one be seen to be the one who was causing the problem. Anyway, so after the darkness, then Pharaoh said, "Go, worship the Lord. Even your women and children may go with you. Only leave the flocks and your herds behind." But Moses said, "Our livestock too must go with us. Not a hoof is to be left behind." In other words, we're not leaving anything, we're just going. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was not willing to let them go. And you have finally the death of the firstborn son, which we looked at then. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh. That's what God said. So during the night, Pharaoh called Moses after his own son had died and said, "Leave my people, you and the Israelites, go. Go worship the Lord. Take your flocks and herds and go, and also bless me." So Pharaoh could realize, actually, he was standing under the judgment of God, and he wanted Moses to pray for him. And so the Israelites then asked the Egyptians for silver and gold. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the people, and they gave them what they asked for. So before the Israelites left, they went to the Egyptians and said, "Please give us gold and silver and clothing and all sorts of things." And the Egyptians happily gave them these things, because the Egyptians had got to the point now where they felt sorry for the Hebrews. They realized what a nasty Pharaoh we have, who's so stubborn and causing all this problem, ruining our whole economy and our society and everything, just because he's so stubborn and won't do a U-turn and won't admit that he's wrong. And so the Egyptians then felt sorry for the Israelites and wanted to give them gifts. And so when the Hebrews, when they left Egypt on good terms with the ordinary Egyptians. There's no bad feeling towards the Egyptians. They just realized this is a problem of a dictator. Yeah?
Are you sure it wasn't from fear?
What?
They gave them all the gold because they've seen the
So,
whole thing.
as I says here, the Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed. In other words, they were favorably disposed. They felt sorry for them. They wanted to, realize they had compassion for them, because they realized how much they'd suffered because of this, this tyrant, this terrible king, Pharaoh. Okay, so does that make more sense about why God hardened Pharaoh's heart? Does that help?
To some extent. I mean, the Lord didn't really harden his heart, right? It's more his personal decisions that
Right.
went into his fire.
Right, so was Pharaoh a free person then?
Yes. Until he got into this Pharaoh, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
Until he got into this Pharaoh.
That's right. He got into this spiral. Yeah.
Slave.
He became a slave to his own concepts and his own obstinacy and his own everything. He just couldn't let go. So he became a slave. So the way the Bible doesn't ask this question, is a human being free or not free? It tells a story. So you can see this story, Pharaoh, who's the most powerful person in Egypt, the most powerful person in the world, you would think this person had absolute freedom because he could do anything he wanted. Because he made these wrong decisions, he became a slave to his own obstinacy and to his own concepts and to his own prejudice and everything else. And so he became stuck. Yeah? He couldn't let go. He couldn't swallow his pride. Even when he did admit he was wrong, he changed his mind again. Yeah? So in that sense, he wasn't in control of himself. He's no longer acting as a rational person. You want politicians that are going to act rationally, not politicians that are going to act irrationally, such that the whole, country is destroyed because they refuse to realize what they're doing is wrong, which so often happens. Yeah, there's been so many dictators like that. The whole country is ruined because they refuse to admit I'm wrong. Yeah, they stop acting rationally. You can see that in Hitler, Stalin, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il. You can just see it going on all the time. Yeah, the lack of rationality. And so, they're no longer. So Pharaoh, he no longer was able to act rationally. He's no longer able to say, well, actually, this is the best decision to make, and I'm going to do that. He lost the freedom to choose the right thing to do because he got all his own problems. Okay, so let's move on, shall we? No more questions about that? Okay. So now you can understand why I decided to postpone the quick answer from last week. Okay, so this is what happened at Passover. So God told the Hebrews then that they should roast the lamb, have a nice kebab, and they were to put some blood on the lintel, which is on the doorpost, and to make unleavened bread. What's unleavened bread?
Without grain, because
it's the flour, but they didn't use yeast. Yeast. Do you know what yeast is? That's right. Yes. So yeast is a fungus, I think, isn't it? Not a bacteria, is it? No, I think it's. I had to consult my biochemist here. Anyway, it makes alcohol in beer, but with flour it makes all the bubbles, makes it expand. So why do you think God told them to make unleavened bread? Smaller. More portable, that's right. They're going to go on a long journey. If you have unleavened bread, this flat bread used for wraps, you can take loads of it, yes? But if you have loaves of bread which have been, it takes up a lot of space. So they wanted to go on a long picnic, all they could carry was in their rucksacks. And so it's a lot easier to take these flat wraps than to take loaves of bread. So they made bread without yeast. Anyway, so that night, it says the angel of death passed over. So it's called Passover because the angel of death passed over the houses of the Hebrews, but the houses of the Egyptians, the people there were killed. Firstborn was killed. And then, as I said, the Egyptians gave them jewelry and clothing and gold and silver. And finally, the Pharaoh allowed them to depart for 3 days. It wasn't let my people go forever. That's how difficult it was to get a 3-day break. Yes? Like a bank holiday and a weekend. All this hassle. So they departed for 3 days. Moses didn't lie. He didn't say we're going to go away for 3 days and come back. After 3 days, he just said we want to go away a 3-day journey into the desert to make our offerings. Anyway, so this is sort of some idea, the best explanation I've come across anyway, of where the subsequent events took place. So Goshen over there on the left, that's where they... Does my cursor go? Oh, yeah, here we are. This is where they're supposed to have lived, around here. This is the area they're supposed to have built, Ramesses. Anyway, so they left here, and it took them 3 days to get to Sukkoth here. And then they carried on, walking, Oh, by the way, this yellow line here, this is the way they would have gone originally if they followed Moses at the very beginning. Anyway, they got to Succoth, and then they carried on walking across the wilderness of the Red Sea. Walking. And after 3 days or 4 days, when they didn't come back for work, then the Pharaoh realized, my workforce has disappeared. I thought they were going to go away for 3 days and come back after 3 days. So anyway, the Hebrews then, they walked, and they got to here. And so they had a 3-day head start on the Egyptians. And so they kept on walking, forced march, and the Egyptians had to try and catch up with them from around about here. So it probably took them a day to get organized, the chariots and the army, and they were chasing. So by the time the Hebrews got here, the Egyptians more or less caught up with them. So people sometimes think, well, they crossed the Dead Sea. But is it possible to, this is the Dead Sea here. Red Sea, I mean. Is it possible to cross the Red Sea? No, completely impossible. But anyway, it took basically 7 days by the time the Egyptians caught up with them. So it took about 7 days walking from here to here, if you walk fast. And this little part here that's called the Gulf of Aqaba, there's two, again, you have, not, I don't know if they're there now, but there's two archaeological remains of two towns, which from thousands of years ago. This one here called Pi-Hahiroth, and on the other side, Baal-Zephon. And in between these two towns, which face each other on the Gulf of Aqaba, there's actually what's called a causeway. So this is like a bridge, a stone link. What's it called now? Let's see if I can find out what it's called. It's called a land bridge, that's right. Anyway, so it's about 3,500 years ago, there was a land bridge between here, which would be covered up when the tide came in. Does anybody, you know where St. Michael's Mount is? It's just, well, there's one in France and there's one off the coast of Cornwall. And when the tide is out, there's a causeway, you can walk across this island. When the tide comes in, you can't, you get drowned. And the tide, when it comes in incredibly quickly, and sometimes people get trapped, caught on the, halfway across the causeway and they get drowned. Anyway, there's evidence of the remains of a land bridge crossing this area here, that when the tide was down, an exceptionally low tide, then people could cross over. And so that seemed to be the best explanation, that they crossed over here after 7 days, which says about a 7-day walk, and then they crossed over here, and then the Egyptians tried to follow after them, but then I guess the tide came in and they all got drowned. And so the Israelites crossed over to here, which is outside Egypt. So this here is Egypt still, and this here is when they left Egypt and went into Arabia, Midian. Okay. So, anyway, on the way out of Egypt, they were guided by a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. Cloud by day and fire by night. It could have been a volcano that they were following towards. And so Moses stretched out his rod when they got to the sea parted, they crossed over, the Egyptians were engulfed and drowned, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. And you can see here, this is the book of Isaiah. There's some sort of memory here. Again, who makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters? There's a sense that there was some kind of land bridge there. Again, there's a sort of, still some archaeological evidence that can be found for these things happening. Anyway, so they crossed over the Red Sea, but then by this stage they'd run out of food, their picnic was all finished, and the people said, if only we'd died, they got really hungry. There's no McDonald's, no fast food places. If only we'd died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat, like barbecues, and ate all the food we wanted, but you've brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. So they'd run out of food, and they were thinking, maybe we would have been better off if we'd stayed behind in Egypt. At least we wouldn't have starved to death. At least there was loads of food there. Anyway, God, he's got a bit of a sense of humour. He said, I'll rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I'll test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day they're to are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. So why on the 6th day was they bring in twice as much? That's right, the 7th day was the Sabbath when they're not to work. Yeah? So no, God was sort of training them. Actually, the first law they were given was to observe the Sabbath, which was work for 6 days and on the 7th day take a rest. Do you think they were used to that? Why not? They've been slaves. They've been working 7 days a week. Yes? Monday to Sunday, Monday to Sunday to Saturday. 7 days a week they've been working. So the first thing God did was he gave them a rest. Work for 6 days because work is good, but 1 day a week you need to take a rest. Take time out. Anyway, so they had bread, and then the people found fault with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." The people murmured against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us with thirst?" So murmuring and complaining. So Moses cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They're ready to stone me." So you can see Moses is getting really exasperated here. Yeah? Whenever he turns to God, whenever things get difficult, talks to God about it. And so God told Moses to strike the rock, and then he struck this rock, and water came out. And this is the rock of Rephidim. So it's sort of rock symbolized Christ, and Jesus referred to himself as the living water. And then they got into a fight with Amalek, which is really quite a nasty little tribe, which lived around there. And they got into a fight, and then Moses went on top of the mountain overlooking it, and then Aaron and Hur, his two assistants, they went to support him. When he had his arms stretched out, then the Hebrews were winning, and when his arm, old man, 80 years old, his arm started to droop, and they started to lose. So Aaron and Hur then held his arms up, and then eventually they won.
That's the tribe where the Israelites even offered to pay them to allow them to pass through, right?
I can't remember now. No, I think that was somebody else. Yeah. No, that was the... They were nasty people. Anyway, so this is the first time the Israelites actually did something. Up until then, who'd done all the work? Yeah, well, somehow all these amazing environmental catastrophes, the plagues, the parting of the sea, it's as if God had done everything. And what did the people do? Moaned, complained. Okay, but this is the first time they actually got involved, and they're the ones that did the fighting. All Moses did was stick his arms up, yeah, just to give them encouragement. But they're the ones that fought. After this, they complained a lot less, because it's the first time they took the initiative. They became responsible. And if you take the initiative and you take responsibility for what goes on, you're much less likely to complain. But people who are dependent and not taking the initiative, not feeling responsible, feeling somebody else should be doing it all, complain a lot. But if one's thinking, oh, there's a problem here, I'm going to solve this problem, then you don't complain. But if you think there's a problem here, why doesn't so-and-so solve the problem, then you do start complaining. Yes? So it's just a human reality. And so this then is an important point, because the first time they took the initiative to do the fighting themselves. Okay, so how did Moses run things? Well, Moses had lunch with Pharaoh. Moses had lunch with Jethro. Who's Jethro? Teresa, do you know who Jethro was? Have you ever heard of the name Jethro before? Never heard of Jethro Tull?
Which one?
No, it's a pop band, isn't it? Rock band from when I was your age. Sorry?
He was an agricultural inventor.
He was an inventor as well, yeah. Okay, anyway, but at this particular time, he was Moses' father-in-law. So Moses married his daughter. Anyway, so after Moses had come out with all these people, Jethro thought, well, I'm going to go and see how my son-in-law's getting on. I'm going to invite myself round for lunch. So he had a nice lunch with Jethro, and, spent all evening chatting and talking about all the things that had happened. The next morning, Moses got up, and he went and sat to judge the people. So he went and sat in a big chair, and people would bring all their problems to him. So two people had a squabble, a disagreement about something. They wanted somebody to sort out their problem. And so they come and ask Moses, what's the right thing? Can you judge between us? Can you make a decision between us about this or about that? And so Moses then sat to judge the people, and the people stood about Moses from morning till evening. So from sunrise to sunset, he was sitting there, people were bringing their problems to him, one problem after another, after another, after another. And so Jethro said, what are you doing? Why do you sit alone? You'll wear yourself out. In other words, you're not a very good manager, are you? You haven't organized this. 600,000 people, and you think you can handle them, all these individual cases by yourself. So Jethro said, look, Jethro is a sort of modern management consultant. He said, you represent the people before God, okay? In other words, if the people got a problem, you bring it and tell God about it. And if God wants to say something to the people, you tell them, the people, God's message. And then he said, teach the people the statutes and the decisions. Tell people what all the rules are and all the decisions, the precedents that have been made. And appoint honest people to judge small matters. And set up an appeal system and only judge the hard cases. In other words, appoint amongst all these people, all the tribes, amongst every 100 people, I think it was, find an honest person who can be like the magistrate. He can be the one that can sort out all these little petty problems. If he doesn't know what the right answer is, then he should go and ask a higher level. And at the higher level, you have all these people within the whole group discussing this particular thing so we can come to some common agreement. It's called a common law about this. So we can make a decision. So if this person makes a decision at this level, then everybody will make the same decision. Yeah, so you get consistency. So if a magistrate didn't know what decision to make, he would appeal, then you'd have the higher level of judges who discuss it, and they would say, right, in this particular case, this is the decision that everybody will make. Yeah, this is the precedent that will be followed. So you had consistency as the application of justice. And then, of course, if these judges couldn't work out what the right thing to do was, then they should come and speak to Moses. Yeah? So this is the basis of English law and English justice. Yeah? Is biblical. It's based upon precedent, At the lowest level, then appeals, going all the way up to the Supreme Court sort of idea. That's the basis of modern Western justice. It's based upon law. And the idea of common law, hard.
It's amazing how many years is that? It's 3,000 years?
Yeah, but this is not just in Britain. This is, in Christian Europe, this is the basis of European the legal system, because it's a Christian continent. People study the Bible. How should we organize our justice system? Well, there it is. That's the model which has been followed.
Is that why we put 12 people on a jury? Is it 12 tribes in Israel?
Pass. I don't know. Anyway, it's very much like that. Anyway, so Moses did... Yeah?
I just have one question. Is there any other continent? This is not like this. And I've never heard about common law until a week ago.
Right.
Okay. But before, was it like this, kind of in the Middle Ages? I'm not really sure. I don't.
Where, in England?
I mean,
England?
I suppose in England it was. I don't know about Europe.
Okay, you want a little mini...
Very short.
Okay, right.
Very, very short.
Okay, the whole of Europe used to be like this.
Yeah.
It's because the source... England still is like this, but Europe was changed by the Romans, by Justinian, and then by Napoleon. But anyway, so I'll explain the way it is in England. The source of authority for law is custom. This is the way we do things around here. Yeah? This is our tradition. This is our way of life. What you've done is you're violating our way of life. You're violating how we expect you to behave. So, for example, when you go to the bus stop, what are you expected to do?
Signal for the bus.
Sorry?
Signal for the bus.
Yeah. What else are you expected to do?
First come, first served.
First come, first served. You stand in a queue. Yeah. Yeah. The person who gets there first has the right to get on first. And that's the way. That's only fair. First come, first served. And then you form a queue, and that's a way of life. That way of life embodies a certain sense of what is just, what is fair, what is right. So that's a tradition. Yeah, that is the source of authority for English law. And so it's a way of life, then becomes a tradition, and certain customs. And if somebody comes along and violates the custom, what do you want done? justice. So if somebody comes along and goes to the front of the queue, people will say, well, you should go to the back. Yes?
Oh, yes,
They do. Yes? That's the way in which the law is enforced, is by ordinary people saying, that's not fair, that's not right, you're acting wrongly. So in a queue, that's a very simple example. But also the same applies to stealing, to murder, all these other things. You've taken this apples from my tree, this tree belongs to me. That's wrong. So this then, the sort of custom tradition then became the law. And so how would you decide where the law... So the law then, how do you decide where the law is? Well, you have a certain hard case, and you have a judgment on that, sets a precedent. Which means when this similar situation occurs, this is where the line is drawn. Yeah, so that becomes the common law. So it's way of life, tradition, way of life, custom, tradition becomes law. Then that means that who has the authority to make law? Yeah? Yes, the law is created by the people, and so the law is there to protect the way of life of the people. And so the king's job, or the government's job, is to uphold the law to protect the way of life of the people. And the most important thing to protect the way of life of the people is to defend the country from being invaded. Yeah? That's the first function of government, is to defend the country, because you're defending people's way of life so that people can live in peace and they can be happy. Yeah? The second function of government is to uphold the law, so murderers, burglars, and all these people, get punished. So you draw the line. There's partly deterrence, partly so they, get what they deserve. And so, as you say, the way of life then becomes a source of authority for law. So traditionally in England, the king doesn't have the authority to make laws, because the law is made by the people. The king's job is to uphold the law. And then things became a bit blurred with Parliament starting to produce all these laws, which it doesn't really have the authority to do, to be honest. Anyway, so the most important laws in England are not written down. They're unwritten laws, common law. You just listened to the Today programme this morning. There was a discussion about this to do with, can't remember what it was now. Then they were thinking of codifying it, writing it down, because it's just unwritten on this particular topic. Anyway, so an example of how this works is that up until about, 20, 25 years ago, I keep forgetting because I get older and I have to keep adding a few more years on. Anyway, up until about a quarter of a century ago, it was not possible in England to commit the crime of raping your wife. Because you're married, because a husband and wife are married, that meant that if they had sexual relations, that was legitimate. Even if the man forced himself upon his wife, that did not count as rape, because he had a right to have sexual relationship with her. So up until about 25 years ago, it was impossible. If a husband forced his wife to have sexual relations, then she couldn't go and complain because he wasn't breaking any law. Okay. So that's, most of history, it's been like that. Anyway, about 25 years ago, this happened. And then the wife went to court. No, he hasn't broken a law. There's no law about this. But the judge said, well, I'll let you appeal. And so she appealed and appealed and appealed and went up to the law lords on the highest level. And they had, I think, 7 or more law lords sat, because it says it's a very important case because we are changing the law. And the judges said, up until now, the way of life of the people is such, and the values of society is such, that nobody would regard a man having that kind of relationship with his wife as being against the law. But society has changed. The values of society have changed. The customs in society have changed. The expectations in society and in marriage have changed. So because society has changed, we are now drawing, the line used to be here, but now the line is here. And he said, yes, it is now possible for a man to rape his wife, and that is now a criminal offence. So it wasn't a law which was made by Parliament, by the king, or by the state. Society changed, and the law changed to reflect the changes within society. So that's the English basically the English system of government, the English... It's all changing now because of the European Union. Anyway, on the continent of Europe, though, so that's the way it used to be on Europe as well, up until the Middle Ages. Yeah, everywhere used to be like this. Anyway, under the Romans, it also used to be like this, going back to the Greeks, going back to Solon, and etc., etc., etc. But then it came to a very critical point with Justinian, who codified the law. I think this was 4th century, early 5th century maybe. Justinian, he codified the law, and then as part of this, he said the emperor has the authority to make law. Yeah. So he said the source of authority for law doesn't reside in the customs and traditions; it resides in the emperor. And there you get this sort of idea, the Roman idea, the emperor was God. So there's a sort of mixing up of different things going on here. And anyway, the emperor decided he had the authority to make laws. Anyway, so just after the fall of the Roman Empire, this is all forgotten. But then during the Renaissance, they discovered the Justinian's legal system. And then English law had developed a lot, whereas on the continent it hadn't been modified, it hadn't progressed. And so when the kings came across Justinian's law, they thought, that's nice. We've got a complete ready-made corpus of law here, which is incredibly well developed and far more advanced than anything on the continent of Europe. And they said, let's implement this. And of course they liked it because they associated themselves with the emperor. And they said, because we're the king, we have the authority to impose this law. We have the authority to make this law. And this moved from the king making law to the state making law. And this is where, in modern Europe, it was picked up by Napoleon, the civil code, which is the basis for all European law now, where it's the state has the authority to make law. So the state decides this is right and this is wrong. Yeah? So the state can give you your rights and the state can take your rights away. Yeah? So that's why it's possible for, in the continent of Europe, to have fascism and communism, because the state has the power and the authority to make law, whereas in England, the state never had that authority or power. So that's why in England they call them statute law, as opposed to common law, which is proper law. Anyway, that's a little digression. Anyway, Moses did as he suggested. So what does this show about Moses?
Listening to advice.
Yes, he was a very humble person. He realized, wow, even though God appears to me and speaks to me, even though I'm the one who's the mediator, actually that was a really good idea. He didn't say, oh, well, God didn't tell me to do that. I'm waiting for God to tell me how to organize things. That's a brilliant idea, Jethro. I'm going to implement that. I'm going to do it. So he was a very humble person. Yes, he was interested in truth and good ideas. It didn't matter where they came from. Yeah? So, again, a very good thing there for ourselves as well. And so, it's now 8:15. Should I go on to this next bit or not? That's a big chunk, really. Actually, maybe I can just do the first part. Okay. So this then is the providence of restoration centering on the tabernacle. So this becomes, and you might wonder what a tabernacle is. Well, a tabernacle is a sort of a mini temple. So this is a picture of a tabernacle here. And it's a sort of mini temple, portable temple. A temple in Jerusalem is made of stone. This is one which is made of, animal skins, a tent which you could pack up and fold up. And so the temple then represented the Messiah. That's why Jesus regarded himself as a temple, dwelling place of God. And so within the temple, you had the Ark of the Covenant. So this was the place here, is where the sacrifices and things were made. So you might wonder, what was the sacrifices about? And basically, it's just a big barbecue. What they would do, they'd bring along a lamb or something, and they would skin it, and they would, slit its throat, and then it would be cooked. And then the priest would take a leg, and the rest of the animal was given back to the family that was making the offering, and they'd all sit round and have a meal together with God. So it's like a religious barbecue, basically. That's what it was all about.
Did they eat all of it, or did they burn half of
Some part was burnt, some part was given to the priests, and a lot of it was given back to them. There were different kinds of sacrifice depending on the occasion and, different things. But that's basically what was going on. They weren't just burning animals. It's incredibly wasteful. It was they were just cooking them and eating a meal together with God. So it's like a family outing. And then this here, so that's what went on here, the sacrifice. And then here, this was the holy place where the priests would go, and right at the back here, where the sort of smoke's coming out, this is where the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was. And this is the Ark of the Covenant here, this gold gilded box with a couple of sticks for carrying it. And inside it were the 2 tablets of stone, which Moses got from the mountain, Aaron's rod, which turned into a snake, the manna, a sample of manna in an urn, and 2 cherubim on the mercy seat. So the cherubim here, like 2 angels, and God said he would speak to Moses between these 2 cherubim. So they had to, in order to be able to receive the tabernacle, then they needed to make a foundation to receive the tabernacle, which is like a foundation to receive the Messiah. So why did God give the tabernacle? Well, if they followed the very original course, united Moses right at the very beginning, then Moses' family would have been the tabernacle and the source of heavenly law. So the way of life in Moses' family would have been the way of life for the people, and that would have been the source of authority for law, the heavenly law. So again, it's a sort of common law tradition which you still find in England. And then Moses then he would have represented the ark and the tabernacles, like the mediator from God. But Moses went. Afterwards, God realized if Moses does something wrong, then you need to have something for everybody to believe in and follow. So the foundation of faith could be passed on even if Moses messed up. And so this then became different. The previous providential age, people made offerings to sacrifices as a mediator. But in this new age, then the Word of God came to be the mediator. So people were justified in their faith by having faith in God's word and God's commandments. Okay, so we'll go into that in a lot more detail over the next couple of weeks. So, I don't want to start the next bit, otherwise I'll be here till 9 o'clock. So, any questions?
So, if I understand, the reason for the codification into the 2 tablets was in case Moses would fail, right? So don't you think that, then in Europe the codification was in case rulers would fail?
Right. Okay. So why do people write things? Why do people write things down?
So
they can be accessed.
Yeah, but have things always been written down?
No.
So before things were written down, how did it work?
Custom.
What?
Custom.
Custom, and the custom was?
telling each other.
Yes, and so it was promise keeping, promise making. So still today in the City of London, you have this expression, my word is my bond. So the way it works, and I just don't know if it still works like this in London, but until very recently, if you got on the phone, you told somebody, right, I want to buy, 1,000 shares in this particular company, and then I'll give you the money tomorrow. You just do it over the phone or just in the cafe. The next day, the share price drops dramatically. What do? Okay, if you say, right. So if you say to your friend or whatever, or not friend, if you say to the person, actually, I don't want to buy the shares, what will he do? And he will never trust you. He will never do business with you ever again. And he will tell other people, don't trust him, and nobody will do business with you ever again. And so that's why the basis of the free market is promise keeping. You have to be a trustworthy person. If you're not trustworthy, if your word cannot be trusted, nobody will do business with you. And the basis then of the free market economy is trust.
Is that money they call a promissory note?
Yes, it's more based on promises. And then later on, sometimes sometimes things became more complicated, and so they write a written note. But even today, under English law, if you make a verbal promise, that is binding, legally binding. Yeah, still legally binding today. A verbal promise is legally binding, because that's the custom, that's tradition. And without it being legally binding, it cannot work. A free market, buying and selling can't work unless they're trustworthy people. So you want to weed out all the trustworthy people by enforcing promise making. Mind-body. So promise making then is basically mind-body unity. What you say and what you do is the same thing. And you can be relied upon to keep your word. And as I said, as society has changed, it worked when everybody knew each other, but it's become more complicated now. So nowadays you get these contracts, you get lawyers involved, and all these other people involved. This is a very recent phenomena, actually, of having all these lawyers involved and writing these long contracts. Before, the City of London was much smaller. Everybody knew everybody. It's just get on the phone, send a little note out, and that's the way it worked. It worked brilliantly for hundreds of years like that. It's only very, very recently things have started to change. And you've got all these long contracts with everything stipulated and lawyers and everything. That's because people, are harder to believe or to trust. Yeah. Anyway, do you want to put the kettle on? Have some tea or coffee or some water or anything? Yeah, thanks very much. Thank you.